Late one autumn afternoon in Crestwood County, the imposing marble facade of the county courthouse loomed over a busy city street, its grandeur belying the storm of injustice that was about to unfold within. The air was crisp and filled with the muted sounds of hurried footsteps and distant traffic. Inside, the courtroom was a world of polished wood, hushed whispers, and tension so thick you could almost cut it with a knife. In that charged atmosphere sat Javon Hart, a 17-year-old black teenager whose gentle demeanor and soulful eyes told a story of quiet resilience. Known throughout his community for his love of music and his heartfelt kindness, Javon had never expected that his life would soon be upended by forces far beyond his control. As the proceedings began that fateful day, Judge Winthrop Caldwell, a tall, white man with sharply cut blonde hair and a reputation for stern authority, took his seat on the bench. His robes were immaculate, his gaze icy and unyielding. The courtroom, filled with attentive legal professionals and a scattering of curious onlookers, was prepared for a standard hearing. But as the judge began reviewing the case files, an undercurrent of tension rippled through the room, as if the very walls were holding their breath. Javon, sitting at the defendant's table with a mixture of apprehension and disbelief etched onto his face, listened intently as the prosecution laid out a series of accusations that were as baffling as they were damning. Whispers in the gallery hinted at evidence that seemed to have been meticulously manipulated, a string of circumstantial details that, taken together, painted Javon as the mastermind behind a series of crimes he knew nothing about. His eyes, normally so full of quiet hope, now darted nervously between the judge and the faces in the room, silently pleading for a chance to explain himself. Then came the moment that would change everything. Judge Caldwell's steely expression darkened as he glanced at a series of documents before him. With a deliberate, almost theatrical pause, he declared that the evidence overwhelmingly pointed to Javon's guilt. Yet, behind the cold precision of his words lay an unspoken truth that few suspected. Judge Caldwell had been watching more than just the courtroom proceedings that day. Unbeknownst to everyone present, a hidden network of cameras and vigilant citizens had been recording every moment, capturing not only the judge's increasingly biased demeanor but also the subtle glances exchanged among a small group of observers who seemed to know more than they let on. As the judge's voice resonated through the cavernous hall, Javon's heart sank. His mind raced back to the countless nights spent pouring his soul into his music, the dreams he had nurtured despite adversity, and now, in a cruel twist of fate, he was being framed by a man entrusted with justice. The judge's words, delivered with an unsettling calmness, accused Javon of crimes that were as foreign to him as the idea of betrayal. Based on the evidence before me, Judge Caldwell intoned, I find Javon Hart guilty of conspiracy and fraud. His gavel came down with a force that echoed like a death knell throughout the courtroom, sealing Javon's fate in that moment. The shock was palpable. Javon's eyes filled with tears as the courtroom erupted into a mix of murmurs and gasps. Those hidden cameras captured every detail, the trembling of Javon's hands, the cold, unblinking stare of Judge Caldwell, and the furtive, almost imperceptible nods among some of the observers. For many, it appeared as though the judge had orchestrated a perfect setup, a meticulously constructed frame that targeted an innocent soul. And yet, amid the chaos and disbelief, a glimmer of resistance began to stir. In a quiet corner of the courtroom, one determined voice rose, an attorney known for her uncompromising integrity, Ms. Mariella Quinton. Though she had not been originally assigned to Javon's case, she could no longer stand by as the wheels of injustice turned unchecked. Her eyes, sharp and filled with conviction, locked onto the judge as she prepared to challenge the narrative that was unfolding. Unaware of the fact that every move was being recorded, Judge Caldwell continued his pronouncement, his voice dripping with finality, as he pronounced a harsh sentence that threatened to upend Javon's future. Outside the locked courtroom, the city's buzz grew louder, and the hidden watchers began to murmur among themselves. Social media lit up with real-time updates from vigilant citizens, and a hashtag emerged that read, #InnocentJavon. The seeds of a grassroots movement had been planted, and though the judge believed he had silenced any opposition, the truth was now gathering momentum from every corner of the community. In that moment of crushing despair, when it seemed that Javon's life was being stolen by a system marred by corruption and prejudice, an undercurrent of hope emerged, a promise that the truth, no matter how deeply buried, would one day be revealed. The stage was set for a battle that would challenge not only the authority of a flawed judicial system but also the very notion of what it meant to be innocent in a world where power could corrupt absolutely. And as the hidden cameras continued to record, and as the murmurs of the watching crowd grew louder, the fight for justice had only just begun. The courtroom was electric with tension as the trial unfolded. After Judge Winthrop Hale's shocking declaration of guilt, every moment in the chamber seemed to pulse with unease. Javon Hart, a 17-year-old with soulful, troubled eyes, sat rigidly at the defendant's table. His hands, barely able to conceal their trembling, clutched a faded photograph of happier times, a reminder of the life he once knew. Across from him, the prosecution painted a damning picture with carefully curated evidence and witness testimonies that, on the surface, left little room for doubt. Yet, beneath the veneer of formality, a hidden narrative was beginning to emerge. From the moment the trial had started, subtle inconsistencies had woven through the proceedings. Judge Hale, with his chiseled features and meticulously groomed blonde hair, maintained an aura of authority, but there was something unnerving in the precision of his questions. His inquiries were pointed and relentless, aimed not at seeking the truth but at reinforcing a narrative that had already been decided. When he questioned Javon about events that he had no recollection of, his tone was cold and dismissive, as if the boy's words were insignificant fragments in a larger, preordained script. Witness after witness took the stand. One by one, they recounted events that painted Javon as the orchestrator of a series of high-profile thefts, crimes that he had never committed. A former classmate, his voice wavering under the weight of what he was forced to say, described seeing Javon in a suspicious light on several occasions. A teacher, who had once admired the gentle nature of the teen, now repeated rehearsed lines that hinted at a calculated rebellion. Each testimony, though delivered with an air of certainty, was interspersed with long, uncomfortable pauses, moments when even the most seasoned jurors exchanged glances that spoke of uncertainty. In the midst of these proceedings, Judge Hale's eyes betrayed a flicker of something darker. Occasionally, his gaze shifted toward a hidden corner of the courtroom where several discreet cameras had been installed by vigilant citizens. Unbeknownst to him, every biased nuance of his conduct was being recorded, the truth of his overreach slowly being captured on film. His voice, unwavering and severe, recited the charges with an unsettling finality that chilled the room. Based on the evidence presented, he intoned, "I find Javon Hart guilty of conspiracy and fraud." His gavel fell with a resounding crack that echoed like a verdict of doom, sealing what many in the room already feared. Despite the damning atmosphere, murmurs of dissent began to rise among a small group of legal experts and community activists present in the gallery. Whispers questioned the authenticity of certain documents and noted peculiarities in witness testimonies that seemed too conveniently aligned with the judge's personal vendetta. In hushed tones, they exchanged theories about the possibility of judicial misconduct, a suspicion that the rigid facade of the trial was a mere cover for a far more sinister agenda. Outside the courtroom, online forums buzzed with live updates, and a growing hashtag #InnocentJavon, started to trend. People began to wonder how such an eloquent, gentle soul as Javon could be ensnared in a trap so meticulously set by someone entrusted with justice. Rumors began to circulate that hidden cameras had captured Judge Hale's secret meetings with dubious figures, suggesting that the trial might have been manipulated from the start. Inside, as the trial wore on, Javon's own testimony was met with both sympathy and incredulity. When questioned about his whereabouts on the nights in question, his recollections were sparse, his voice quivering with the trauma of being forced to watch his life unravel. He struggled to articulate the fear and isolation he had experienced, but his words were enough to cast doubt on the version of events the prosecution had constructed. His eyes, dark pools of pain and longing, spoke silently of a life burdened by injustice, a truth that resonated with many, even as the judge's gavel kept resounding in the background. The courtroom was a battleground of competing narratives. The defense team, led by an unanticipated yet fiercely determined attorney named Mariella Quinton, began to challenge the prosecution's carefully assembled evidence. Mariella's cross-examination was sharp and relentless. She questioned the inconsistencies in the witness statements and demanded clarification on the financial records that had been presented as proof of Javon's alleged crimes. Her voice, steady and unwavering, hinted at a larger, more complex web of deceit, one that involved not only Javon but also powerful figures who had manipulated the system to their advantage. As the hours wore on, the atmosphere grew increasingly charged with anticipation and hidden truths. Every whispered word, every furtive glance exchanged between the observers, contributed to the mounting pressure. It became evident that the trial was not simply a legal proceeding, but a struggle for the very soul of the justice system, a fight to ensure that a young man, whose only fault was his vulnerability, would not be condemned by a system tainted by corruption and bias. In that moment, as the judge's imposing presence and the defense's passionate rebuttals intermingled, a silent promise was made. The courtroom, though locked in a grim determination to uphold the law, was also becoming a stage for truth to eventually rise. Hidden cameras continued to capture every moment, and the growing chorus of public outrage promised that no injustice would remain hidden forever. The seeds of a grassroots movement were being sown within those hallowed walls, a movement that would one day demand transparency and accountability, ensuring that the light of truth would shatter the shadows cast by corruption. And so, in that charged environment, with the echoes of the gavel still reverberating through the solemn hall, the battle for Javon Hart's innocence began in earnest, a battle that would soon set in motion a chain of events destined to expose a system riddled with prejudice and deceit, and ultimately, to restore hope to a community desperate for justice. In the days that followed the courtroom's shocking verdict, a quiet storm began to gather both inside and beyond the marble walls of the courthouse. Behind the imposing facade of Judge Winthrop Caldwell's courtroom, whispers of inconsistency and injustice began to ripple through the legal corridors. For Javon Hart, a 17-year-old whose gentle demeanor had been marred by the harsh judgment, each passing moment felt like an eternity, as if the world itself were conspiring to bury the truth under layers of manipulated evidence and prejudice. Unbeknownst to Judge Caldwell and his staunch supporters, a small but determined group of legal experts, community activists, and vigilant citizens had started to take notice. Late at night, in cramped apartments and quiet suburban basements, these individuals gathered around computer screens, poring over court transcripts, financial documents, and subtle nuances in witness testimonies. Among them was Kian Lyons, a resourceful young man with a talent for digital forensics. Kian spent countless hours sifting through digital records and surveillance footage, his eyes growing more intense with every discrepancy he uncovered. In the grainy video clips from hidden cameras installed by concerned citizens, he noticed that Judge Caldwell's gaze sometimes shifted towards a concealed corner of the courtroom, a momentary look that spoke of secret meetings and undisclosed alliances. As Kian compiled his findings, online forums and social media platforms began to light up with a growing hashtag Justice for Javon. Ordinary citizens, outraged by the mounting evidence of potential judicial misconduct, shared their own observations. Videos, blurry though they were, showed snippets of the judge's conversations with figures who were clearly not part of the official proceedings. The digital movement swelled with each new upload, turning what had initially seemed like an isolated miscarriage of justice into a full-blown public outcry. Tweets, Facebook posts, and even viral TikTok videos questioned the fairness of the trial and demanded an independent investigation into Judge Caldwell's actions. Inside the courthouse, the atmosphere was no less charged. During breaks in the proceedings, whispered conversations among the legal staff and even some of the more seasoned attorneys revealed that doubts were beginning to surface. A seasoned prosecutor confided to a colleague that certain pieces of evidence seemed to have been curated rather than discovered, a word that carried an ominous implication of deliberate manipulation. Even the normally implacable Judge Caldwell's composed exterior was rumored to have faltered and confronted with dissenting voices from within his own chambers. The once orderly court sessions were now punctuated by murmurs of inconsistencies and cover-ups, and the energy in the room shifted from resigned acceptance to a simmering anticipation of a revelation. At the center of this emerging rebellion was a determined attorney named Mariella Quinton. With a reputation for fearlessly championing the underdog, Mariella had not been part of Javon's original defense team. However, as more evidence of judicial overreach came to light, she volunteered to lead a fresh inquiry into the case. In a series of impassioned interviews with witnesses and through her own meticulous cross-examination of existing evidence, she began to unravel a tangled web of deception. Her approach was methodical yet fervent, as she pressed on every inconsistency until the facade began to crack. With each question, she revealed that the charges against Javon were built on documents that bore the unmistakable imprint of bias and that several key witnesses had been coached, if not outright coerced, into delivering testimonies that supported the judge's predetermined narrative. Mariella's findings soon reached the ears of a growing community of supporters. Local activists organized quiet rallies outside the courthouse, and sympathetic reporters started to broadcast snippets of the unfolding drama. The story was rapidly evolving into a fight not just for one innocent life, but for the integrity of the entire judicial system. The phrase, "unaware who's watching," became a rallying cry among those demanding accountability, emphasizing that hidden cameras, vigilant citizens, and brave whistleblowers were now united in their quest for the truth. As the pressure mounted, Detective Ariana Storm, a tenacious officer with a keen eye for detail, was assigned to re-examine the evidence against Javon. With her team, she discovered a series of financial transactions and confidential emails that suggested a disturbing collusion between influential local figures and Judge Caldwell himself. These findings painted a picture of a system deeply compromised, where power and money had conspired to silence an innocent boy. The revelations were staggering, and they forced even those in the courtroom to question the veracity of the trial's outcome. Through these long, painstaking days, the digital world became a megaphone for justice. Activists, legal experts, and everyday citizens shared every new piece of evidence, fueling a movement that demanded a full-scale investigation. While the judge and his allies sought to maintain their grip on the narrative, the growing chorus of dissent proved that the truth could not be easily hidden. Inside the lockdown courtroom, as the twins' voices faded into the background and the echo of Judge Caldwell's gavel still reverberated through the hall, an unspoken promise hung in the air, that every shred of manipulated evidence, every coerced testimony, and every shadow of bias would soon be exposed. The battle for Javon Hart's innocence was far from over, but in that charged atmosphere, with hidden cameras capturing every moment and public outrage surging like a tidal wave, the seeds of change were being sown, a change that would eventually shatter the walls of corruption and restore hope to a community desperate for justice. In the quiet moments between legal maneuvers and digital outcries, the truth gathered strength, setting the stage for the next phase of the struggle, a phase where every voice, no matter how small, would be heard, and where the darkness of a broken system would finally be illuminated by the relentless pursuit of justice. In the tense days following the courtroom lockdown, as whispers of injustice began to ripple through every corner of Crestwood County, a hidden world of evidence emerged that would challenge the very foundation of the trial. Deep in the back alleys and quiet corners of the city, a network of vigilant citizens and independent journalists had quietly mobilized. Among them was Kian Lyons, a young digital forensic expert whose keen eyes and relentless determination had already begun to unravel inconsistencies in Judge Caldwell's behavior. Late at night, by the glow of multiple screens in a cramped apartment cluttered with notebooks and cables, Kian pored over grainy security footage and intercepted audio clips. His discoveries painted an unsettling picture: brief, almost imperceptible moments when Judge Caldwell's steely gaze slipped toward a shadowy corner of the courtroom, and whispered exchanges with figures whose identities were obscured by dark suits and muted voices. Every discrepancy, every minor detail that defied the judge's public persona, hinted at a hidden collusion, an orchestration of events designed not to seek truth, but to secure a predetermined outcome. As Kean compiled his findings into a detailed report, a surge of digital evidence began to circulate among online communities and activist groups. Social media erupted with the hashtag #JusticeForJavon, as people shared snippets of video and audio that contradicted the judge's narrative. Amateur detectives and seasoned reporters alike became captivated by the mystery, and soon a small but determined group of legal reform advocates emerged, demanding a thorough investigation into the apparent judicial misconduct. Their collective voice grew louder with each new piece of evidence: eyewitness accounts that recounted odd exchanges in the courtroom corridors, testimonies from former court clerks who remembered secret meetings, and even discreet recordings from hidden cameras placed by concerned citizens during public sessions. In the sterile corridors of the courthouse, whispers turned into urgent discussions. A respected local attorney, Mariella Quinton, who had recently joined Javon's defense team, began to question the very integrity of the trial. In closed-door meetings with fellow legal experts, she presented her growing dossier of evidence: documents with altered metadata, unexplained financial transfers linked to Judge Caldwell's office, and even internal emails that hinted at a mutual arrangement between the judge and shadowy figures in the local criminal underworld. These revelations were not merely technicalities, they were the cracks in a facade that had long concealed corruption. Meanwhile, the atmosphere in the courtroom itself became even more charged. During recess, as the twins huddled quietly in a secure room and the staff busied themselves with arranging for protective services, the judge's previously confident demeanor began to show subtle signs of strain. His eyes, which once held an unyielding authority, now flickered with anxiety as he learned of the growing public outcry. Rumors of his secret meetings and questionable conduct began to spread, reaching even the higher echelons of the legal community. Some judges, previously silent on the matter, began to whisper among themselves, questioning whether the scales of justice were truly balanced. In an effort to quell the burgeoning dissent, local media outlets launched investigative segments that featured interviews with whistleblowers and court insiders. One particular exposé, broadcast during a late-night news cycle, showcased grainy footage of the judge in a heated conversation with an unidentified man in a dark suit. Although the images were blurry and the voices muffled, the impact was undeniable. It confirmed the suspicions of many who had long believed that Javon Hart's trial was being manipulated from behind closed doors. As the digital evidence amassed, the community's pressure mounted. Activists organized peaceful protests outside the courthouse, their chants echoing through the city streets and drawing the attention of national news. Supporters of Javon, along with advocates for judicial transparency, demanded that an independent review be launched to examine every facet of the trial. Public sentiment shifted palpably, with even longtime supporters of the legal establishment beginning to question the integrity of the system that had so ruthlessly condemned an innocent boy. Amid this turbulent atmosphere, Detective Ariana Storm and her team worked tirelessly to corroborate the digital evidence with on-the-ground investigations. Their findings, when presented in a comprehensive briefing to the district attorney, left little room for doubt. The corrupt ties between Judge Caldwell and a network of local criminals were laid bare in a series of meticulously compiled reports. The evidence was overwhelming: a collection of hacked emails, secured financial records, and first-hand accounts that collectively suggested a deliberate manipulation of the judicial process. In that moment, the hidden world of unseen witnesses and digital sleuths had forced the powerful to confront a stark reality: the truth, however obscured, had a way of emerging. As news of these revelations spread, the once impermeable walls of the courtroom began to crumble under the weight of public scrutiny. The very foundations of the trial were now under siege, and the battle for Javon Hart's innocence had entered a new, decisive phase. The movement for justice was no longer confined to whispered secrets and isolated investigations. It had become a force that could not be silenced, a promise that every injustice, no matter how deeply buried, would eventually be brought to light. Inside the locked courtroom, the atmosphere had grown so thick with tension that even the slightest whisper seemed to reverberate off the marble walls. What had begun as an ordinary trial had now become a battleground for truth and justice, a struggle that would determine not only the fate of Javon Hart but also the very integrity of a system meant to protect the innocent. As the day wore on, Judge Caldwell's stern gaze had never wavered from Javon, whose quiet protestations of innocence were increasingly at odds with the damning evidence marshaled against him. The prosecution, with their meticulously prepared documents and rehearsed witness testimonies, painted a portrait of a young man steeped in criminal intent. But beneath that veneer, a small but persistent undercurrent of doubt had been gathering among a few members of the courtroom. During a brief recess, murmurs of concern spread like wildfire through the gallery. Legal experts whispered that some testimonies seemed staged and that certain documents bore marks of tampering. The air was electric with uncertainty and silent anger. Then, in a moment that would become the turning point of the trial, one key witness, a man whose initial testimony had been instrumental in the case against Javon, was called back to the stand. Under the intense cross-examination of Mariella Quinton, the defense attorney known for her fearless advocacy, the witness's previously confident account began to crumble. His voice faltered as Mariella meticulously questioned the discrepancies in his statements. With each pointed question, his recollections turned uncertain, and finally, with tears welling in his eyes, he admitted that he had been coerced into testifying by powerful figures connected to the judge's inner circle. The courtroom fell into a stunned silence. In that fragile moment, the truth that had been obscured by layers of manipulation and fear began to emerge. Judge Caldwell's expression hardened as the recantation echoed through the room. For the first time, the judge's eyes revealed a trace of conflict, a silent, internal struggle between the rigidity of the law and the undeniable evidence of injustice that was now on display. Even as the prosecution scrambled to salvage their narrative, Mariella Quinton pressed further, her voice steady and resolute, demanding that every piece of manipulated evidence be brought to light. The atmosphere became charged with an urgent need for transparency. Even the court clerks exchanged anxious glances as they hurriedly re-examined documents that now appeared suspicious under the harsh scrutiny of the defense. Outside the courtroom, news of the witness's recantation began to spread rapidly. Social media exploded with the hashtag #JusticeForJavon, and small groups of activists gathered, their determination fueled by the growing tide of evidence against a corrupt system. In hushed conversations, people speculated that Judge Caldwell himself might have been involved in a network of coercion, an accusation that sent tremors through the very foundations of the trial. Back inside, as the judge reconvened the session, he spoke with a tone that was both measured and somber. "We will take a brief recess," he announced, his voice resonating through the tense chamber. For several long minutes, the courtroom remained in a state of suspended silence. Javon, whose eyes were now brimming with a mixture of despair and a nascent spark of hope, clutched a small, worn photograph of his mother, an image that had once been his only connection to the love he had lost. His fingers trembled, but his gaze, though haunted, held the courage of a soul determined to reclaim its innocence. During the recess, Judge Caldwell met privately with a panel of senior prosecutors and investigative officers. They pored over the new evidence, their voices low and urgent as they debated the implications of the witness's recantation. The discussion grew heated as more discrepancies were revealed, and it became increasingly clear that the narrative constructed by the prosecution was built on a foundation of manipulated records and coerced testimonies. In that charged atmosphere, even the judge's rigid exterior began to show subtle signs of doubt, a rare moment when the scales of justice teetered precariously between the force of authority and the undeniable pull of truth. When the courtroom reconvened, the tension was palpable. The judge's eyes, once so impassive, now flickered with a cautious determination. Based on the new evidence presented, Judge Caldwell began, his voice carefully measured, "This court must re-examine the validity of the charges against Mr. Hart." His words, though not yet a formal overturning of the verdict, signaled a seismic shift in the proceedings. The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder as the defense team exchanged relieved glances, and even some members of the prosecution appeared visibly unsettled. Mariella Quinton took the floor once again, her voice clear and unwavering as she demanded that all evidence related to the recanted testimony and the questionable financial records be reviewed by an independent panel. "This is not just about one case," she declared passionately, "it is about ensuring that our judicial system remains a beacon of fairness and truth, not a tool for personal gain and corruption." Her words resonated deeply with the assembled crowd, fueling a sense of hope that the tide of injustice might finally be turning. In that climactic moment, the judge's gavel fell with a deliberate pause, a pause that echoed the gravity of what was to come. The courtroom, once a battleground of conflicting narratives, now stood as a testament to the power of perseverance and the relentless pursuit of truth. The recanted witness testimony, the digital evidence meticulously compiled by independent investigators, and the impassioned defense of Javon Hart all coalesced into a turning point that promised to reshape the trial entirely. As the day drew to a close, and the courtroom slowly emptied into the cool evening air, one undeniable truth remained: the breaking point had been reached, and the seeds of justice had been sown. Javon's future, once clouded by a corrupt system, now glimmered with the faint but persistent light of redemption. And in that moment of profound transformation, the promise of truth, no matter how deeply hidden, held the power to restore not only an innocent life but the very integrity of a society desperate for change. In the aftermath of the courtroom's dramatic upheaval, the momentum for truth surged into the corridors of power. Detective Ariana Storm, a resolute investigator known for her unyielding pursuit of justice, took charge of re-examining every shred of evidence surrounding Javon Hart's trial. For weeks, she worked tirelessly in a modest office cluttered with case files, photocopies of court transcripts, and scattered notes scribbled in haste. Late nights found her poring over digital records and rewatching the grainy security footage captured in the courtroom, a montage of fleeting glances, subtle shifts, and suspicious exchanges that had previously gone unnoticed. Every morning, as the first rays of sunlight filtered through her window, Detective Storm reviewed the growing dossier that painted a disturbing picture of systemic corruption. One piece of evidence, in particular, drew her focus: a series of encrypted emails exchanged between high-ranking court officials and local criminal elements. The messages hinted at covert meetings, undisclosed financial kickbacks, and even explicit instructions to manipulate witness testimonies. With each decrypted line, her conviction deepened: the trial was not merely a miscarriage of justice, it was a deliberate orchestration meant to convict an innocent young man. Determined to expose the truth, Detective Storm coordinated with her team and reached out to independent forensic experts. Together, they painstakingly analyzed the metadata of key documents and discovered irregularities that suggested tampering. In a breakthrough moment, an audio file recovered from a hidden security camera revealed a hushed, hurried conversation between Judge Caldwell and an unknown associate, their voices laced with urgency and unspoken collusion. The recording, though faint and fragmented, was enough to validate the suspicions that had long simmered beneath the surface of the trial. Meanwhile, the public's outcry continued to swell. Online communities, spurred by hashtags like #JusticeForJavon and #ExamineTheJudge, rallied behind the cause. Local news stations, once reluctant to challenge the established narrative, now aired investigative segments that questioned the integrity of the judicial process. Whistleblowers from within the courthouse discreetly shared additional evidence, and every new detail fed the growing demand for accountability. In a series of impassioned public forums, community leaders and legal experts debated how a single case could expose such deep-rooted corruption, and calls for an independent review of the entire judicial system began to echo through the county. As Detective Storm's investigation unfolded, her findings were compiled into a comprehensive report that was handed over to the district attorney's office. The report, spanning hundreds of pages and supported by forensic analyses, eyewitness testimonies, and digital evidence, was a damning indictment of the mechanisms that had manipulated the trial of Javon Hart. The document detailed the suspicious alterations of financial records, the orchestrated witness recantation, and even the judge's secret meetings with figures known to be associated with organized crime. Every detail was laid out meticulously, creating a roadmap that pointed to a network of corruption that extended far beyond one courtroom. The day the report was presented in a follow-up hearing was tense and historic. The courtroom, now filled with a renewed mix of cautious optimism and raw determination, waited in breathless anticipation as the district attorney read aloud key excerpts from the report. The judge, once the unchallenged arbiter of justice, listened with an unreadable expression that slowly morphed into one of grim realization. The evidence was irrefutable, and the atmosphere in the room shifted as a palpable sense of accountability began to take hold. For Javon Hart, whose future had once seemed sealed by the judge's biased decree, a new possibility emerged, a promise that the truth, no matter how deeply obscured, could ultimately prevail. Detective Storm's relentless pursuit of evidence and the collective effort of the community had set in motion a chain reaction that would upend a corrupt system. In that moment, as the district attorney concluded his reading with a vow to re-examine every detail of the case, the entire courtroom seemed to exhale in unison, the weight of injustice momentarily lifted by the power of truth. As the hearing adjourned, whispers of hope and determination filled the corridors of the courthouse. Detective Storm, her eyes still weary from endless nights of investigation, stepped out into the cool evening air with a quiet sense of purpose. She knew that while the battle for Javon's exoneration was far from over, the foundation had been laid for a thorough reckoning, a future where every manipulated record and coerced testimony would be exposed. In that long, arduous journey for justice, her report was not merely a document, it was a beacon that promised to restore balance, mend fractured lives, and ensure that the voices of the innocent would be heard above the clamor of corruption. The growing storm of evidence and public outcry finally reached a critical mass in the weeks leading up to what would become the defining moment of the trial. As the courthouse became the center of relentless scrutiny, both from the legal community and everyday citizens, the walls of corruption that had previously kept the injustices in place began to crack under the pressure. Javon Hart, once thrown into despair, found an unexpected ally in an army of determined citizens, legal experts, and whistleblowers, all united under the banner of truth. In the private chambers of the courthouse, where once hidden alliances were now exposed, Judge Winthrop Caldwell remained defiant, even as the whispers of misconduct against him mounted. His once unshakable confidence now seemed fragile, as cracks began to appear in his controlled facade. Yet, in his mind, he convinced himself that the system that had worked to his benefit for so long would hold. He simply needed to push through the final weeks of Javon's trial. But the tide of public opinion shifted dramatically. Activists, once marginalized, found their voices amplified in every corner of the country. The hashtag Justice for Javon spread like wildfire through social media platforms, while local news stations and investigative reporters began uncovering even more damning information. The evidence that had been pieced together by Detective Ariana Storm, alongside the growing catalog of testimonies and covert recordings piece by piece, painted an undeniable portrait of systemic bias and corruption. One key witness, Carl Mason, a former associate of Judge Caldwell, finally broke under the mounting pressure. Having kept quiet for years out of fear for his safety, Carl had harbored guilt over the judge's alarming actions in previous cases similar to Javon's. When he reached out to the investigative journalists, he could no longer stand by and watch an innocent man be convicted while a corrupt system continued to destroy lives. In a stunning revelation later shared under court protection, Carl admitted to a dark truth: Judge Caldwell had been bribed for years by a powerful local syndicate, interested in the favorable handling of legal cases. His confession linked a series of organized criminal activities directly to the judge's decision-making in court. Video footage of secret meetings with key figures, now confirmed to be part of the syndicate, surfaced, implicating Judge Caldwell in efforts to use his position of power to manipulate cases for financial rewards. The legal community was thrown into chaos. The once unimpeachable integrity of the justice system was now in question. Even those who had initially assumed Javon's guilt now began to ask uncomfortable questions about their own involvement. The more the investigation dug, the more it became clear that the judge had used his platform to silence dissent, punish those he deemed unworthy, and further his own interests. And the public, armed with this information, demanded to know how such a man was able to maintain his power for so long. In response to the revelations, the district attorney's office pushed for an immediate and full investigation into Judge Caldwell's actions. It was an unprecedented move, and it sent shockwaves through the legal world. Even the most staunch defenders of the judicial system were forced to reckon with the uncomfortable truth: justice had been manipulated, and rituals that everyone had once believed immune to exploitation had, in fact, been corrupted by greed and power. But the public, torn between outrage and empathy, now had hope. Amid this turmoil, Javon found himself at the center of a larger fight, not just for his freedom, but for the principles of justice and fairness that had been denied to so many before him. His voice, once silenced by the weight of the system, now resonated in the seats of power and protest alike. He had become an unlikely hero, a symbol for a movement that had begun to spread far beyond Crestwood County. As news of Judge Caldwell's imminent removal from office spread, whispers of impending charges against him grew louder. Advocates for Javon celebrated the small victories, but they knew the road was far from over. The path to accountability was still uncertain, and many feared that Judge Caldwell, despite mounting evidence, would escape with minimal consequence through his legal connections. In a final push, Detective Storm and the legal team, led by Javon's attorney Mariella Quinton, worked tirelessly to assemble an airtight case against the judge, ensuring every shred of evidence was corroborated, every legal loophole accounted for. The courtroom became an arena where words weighed more heavily than ever before, as Mariella's defense strategy was now built not just on proving Javon's innocence but uncovering the corruption embedded within the very system that had betrayed him. The appointment of a special prosecutor and independent investigators was the final defeat for Judge Caldwell. As the investigation reached its climax, the prosecutor assembled a crucial legal team to carry out a transparent, thorough examination of every aspect of Caldwell's career. No stone would be left unturned. When the charges against Caldwell were formally read out, there was no feeling of triumph, only a quiet, layered injustice that weighed heavy on those who had supported the flawed system for so long. How had so many turned a blind eye? How many other cases had the judge tainted in his pursuit of power? Nevertheless, in that moment of reckoning, both the court and the community began to see a possibility for justice to be truly served. Javon finally found solace as the first steps toward institutional change were implemented. For him, the battle for justice had become synonymous with the battle for his identity and dignity as a young man, a battle he was, at long last, winning. The momentum for change was unstoppable now, and the court filled with cautious optimism. The cracks in the system would not be easily repaired, but more and more voices were now dedicated to rebuilding something that would, hopefully, prevent such a miscarriage of justice from ever happening again. 27. In the charged aftermath of Detective Storm's damning report and the mounting public outcry, the courtroom transformed into a stage for the final showdown. The day began with an air of electricity that no one in Crestwood County could ignore. In a packed courtroom that had become the epicenter of a movement for justice, Judge Winthrop Caldwell returned to the bench with a noticeably strained expression. The once imposing judge, known for his steely authority, now bore the unmistakable marks of internal conflict as whispers of his own misconduct swirled around him. At the front of the courtroom, the defense team, led by the determined attorney Mariella Quinton, took the stand. Today, Mariella was armed not only with the testimony of a brave young man but also with the weight of digital evidence meticulously compiled by independent investigators. The hidden cameras had captured every suspicious glance, every hushed conversation between Judge Caldwell and shadowy figures, and every anomaly in the court documents. As Mariella began her cross-examination of a key prosecution witness, her voice rang clear and unwavering. "Is it not true that you were coerced into giving your previous testimony by those who feared the truth?" Her question, laced with both precision and emotion, sent a ripple of shock through the room. Javon Hart, the 17-year-old who had been framed by a corrupt system, sat quietly at the defendant's table. His eyes, once filled with a resigned sorrow, now shone with a fragile spark of determination. The testimony of his friend Kean Lyons, a digital forensic expert who had painstakingly uncovered evidence of judicial manipulation, had shattered the narrative constructed by Judge Caldwell. Every word from Kean had added another piece to the puzzle: encrypted emails, altered records, and covert recordings that implicated not only the judge but also a network of local criminals. Outside the courtroom, the city buzzed with the sound of protests. Supporters gathered in large numbers, their placards reading #JusticeForJavon and "Expose the Corruption." The media, previously complicit in the sanitized version of events, now reported live as the tension inside the courthouse escalated. Social media platforms erupted with video clips and real-time commentary, amplifying the demand for transparency and accountability. It was clear that the walls of the courthouse, once impervious to public scrutiny, were now crumbling under the force of collective outrage. As the hours passed, Judge Caldwell attempted to reassert control. His voice, now tinged with desperation, recited legal formalities that fell flat in the face of overwhelming evidence. Mariella Quinton methodically dismantled every argument he presented, her probing questions laying bare the extent of the judicial impropriety. At one point, she introduced a series of documents that showed suspicious financial transactions between the judge's office and known criminal elements, a revelation that caused even the most skeptical jurors to murmur in disbelief. The turning point came during a climactic testimony when a witness, previously coerced into supporting the prosecution, broke down completely under Mariella's relentless questioning and recanted his earlier statements. "I was frightened," the witness confessed, voice quivering, "and I lied because they threatened me." The raw honesty of that moment sent shockwaves through the courtroom. In that instant, the judge's carefully constructed facade of impartiality was irreparably shattered. With every new piece of evidence, the public's demand for justice grew louder, and Judge Caldwell's authority wavered visibly. The atmosphere in the courtroom became electric with the knowledge that the truth, long suppressed by power and fear, was finally emerging. The district attorney, who had been on the defensive until now, stood to address the court and declared that an independent review of the entire trial would be initiated immediately. His announcement was met with a standing ovation from those present, a resounding affirmation that the community would no longer tolerate the corruption that had haunted their legal system. In a final, dramatic moment, Judge Caldwell, his face lined with resignation and regret, called a recess. As the gavel struck with a hollow echo, the courtroom fell silent, the weight of the revelations lingering in the air. Javon, though still uncertain of what the future held, felt a new sense of hope. He realized that his fight for innocence was now part of a larger struggle, a battle against a corrupt system that was finally being exposed. Outside, as protesters chanted and reporters scrambled to capture the unfolding story, the seeds of systemic change were being sown. The courtroom had become a battleground not just for one boy's freedom but for the integrity of justice itself. And as the day came to an end, with hidden cameras still rolling and every whispered secret now laid bare, it was clear that the final reckoning was imminent, a reckoning that promised to restore truth, mend broken lives, and light the way toward a future defined by accountability and hope. In the weeks that followed the explosive courtroom showdown and the damning revelations of judicial corruption, a remarkable transformation began to take root in Crestwood County. The community, once divided by suspicion and fear, united in a collective demand for accountability and change. The once hallowed halls of the courthouse, now tarnished by scandal and deceit, became a symbol of rebirth and hope, a stark reminder that even the deepest wounds could heal under the light of truth. Javon Hart, whose life had been nearly ruined by a rigged trial and a corrupt judge, was officially exonerated. In a public ceremony held in the county square, surrounded by supporters and local activists, he stepped forward to reclaim his identity. His voice, once silenced by the weight of false accusations, rang clear as he recounted his painful journey, and in doing so, he became a beacon for others who had suffered at the hands of a broken system. Every word he spoke resonated with the promise that justice, though delayed, would prevail. Judge Caldwell, stripped of his power and facing charges of corruption and misconduct, was subjected to a rigorous independent investigation. The fallout from his actions sparked a wave of reforms throughout the local judicial system. New protocols were established to ensure greater transparency and to protect vulnerable witnesses, while independent oversight committees were formed to prevent any recurrence of the manipulation that had once sealed Javon's fate. The judge's downfall was not celebrated with glee, but it served as a potent reminder that even those in positions of authority must be held accountable for their actions. Detective Ariana Storm and her team, along with digital forensic experts and brave whistleblowers, continued to expose the networks of corruption that had once manipulated the course of justice. Their relentless efforts led to a series of arrests and reforms, culminating in a sweeping legislative initiative that increased funding for child protection and bolstered the oversight of all public trials in the county. The case of Javon Hart had, in its darkest moments, ignited a fire for systemic change, an enduring legacy that promised to shield future generations from similar injustices. Within this tumultuous backdrop, Javon's personal life began to rebuild in earnest. Reunited with his family and supported by a community that had fought fiercely for his freedom, he immersed himself in the healing power of music, a lifelong passion that had once been his only refuge. At community centers and local schools, his story inspired others. His soulful performances and heartfelt lyrics told of resilience, hope, and the transformative power of truth. Slowly, the labels of guilt and shame that had once haunted him gave way to the warmth of acceptance and the promise of a brighter future. In a quiet corner of the reformed courthouse, a memorial mural was unveiled, a vibrant depiction of a rising sun breaking through dark, stormy clouds, symbolizing the relentless triumph of light over darkness. Families, activists, and survivors gathered beneath its colorful arches, their faces illuminated by a shared hope that the injustices of the past would never be forgotten, and that every challenge could be met with unity and compassion. As dusk fell on that historic day, the air was filled with a gentle hum of celebration and resolve. Javon, standing with his family and supported by the community's unwavering solidarity, looked out over the crowd with eyes that had once been full of despair now shining with determination. His journey, marked by pain and perseverance, had reached a pivotal turning point, a new dawn that promised healing not only for him but for an entire community that had learned the true cost of indifference. In that final, tender moment, as the courthouse lights dimmed and the murmurs of hope echoed through the corridors, the story of Javon Hart became a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. It was a story that had started in darkness but, through the courage of individuals willing to stand up for truth, ended in a celebration of renewal. Every tear, every whispered cry for justice, had paved the way for a future where integrity and compassion would forever guide the paths of those who believed that no one should ever be silenced by corruption. And as the night embraced the county in a soft, forgiving glow, Crestwood County stepped boldly into a new era, a time when the light of hope outshone the shadows of the past, promising that every broken heart could be mended and every innocent voice would finally be heard.